Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1283rd New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Dr. Jareh Das and Chenoa Baker. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Dr. Jareh Das is an independent curator working between the UK and West Africa. Her work explores the intersections of modern and contemporary art, as well as performance. Das holds a PhD in curating art and science, new methods, and sites of production from Royal Holloway at University of London, where her research explored live art practices within the context of visual arts. Her curatorial and writing practices privilege embodied knowledge and move fluidly across exhibitions, performances, and critical texts. And our host today, Chenoa Baker, is a curator, writer, professor, and descendant of self-emancipators. She has contributed to major exhibitions, including Geo Swaby, Fresh Up at the Peabody Essex Museum, Touching Roots, Black Ancestral Legacies in the Americas at the MFA Boston, Simone Lee at the ICA Boston, and Simone Lee Sovereignty debuted at the US Pavilion for the Venice Biennale. In recognition for her curatorial work, she received the WBUR Maker Award and was featured on NPR's All Things Considered in 2024. We are lucky to have Chenoa as a contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Chenoa to get us started and with lots and lots of gratitude.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much again for having me in this space. I'm so excited to get into the meat of this conversation. I know Dr. Jareh and I have been in conversation for a little bit, and I'm excited to welcome everybody into that conversation. So I guess we can get right into it, and to talk really about the origins and intentions of the exhibition. Something that was, very striking to me. There aren't many exhibitions like this. It's unique, it's fresh, it's a new take on ceramics, on Black feminism, on Black women ceramicists. There's so many things to pull from. So, Jareh, I really want to bring your voice into this conversation, and I would love to prompt you with the question of what was your beginning curatorial question for the exhibition, and how did that shift or change over time?
Thank you so much, Chenoa, and thank you, Chloe, and everyone at the Rail for hosting this event. So really, the beginnings of this exhibition began as a research project. About a decade ago, I was working in a museum in the north of England, and I had this encounter in the collection of objects that were identified as pupils of Michael Cardew Abuja pottery. I'm of Nigerian heritage. I grew up in Lagos. I wasn't familiar with Abuja pottery at the time. And, I was just very curious as to how these objects got to where they were, this encounter with them in the north of England. And that began, a bit of an obsessive sort of research project, as I mentioned. But really, I think the sort of beginning inquiry was, why don't we have individual names? Why is it just this sort of collective grouping? The more I researched about Michael Cardew and his time in Nigeria, he's a super prominent British studio potter. So that was the beginning of that inquiry. And then finding out that Ladi Kwali was in a sense a star of this pottery training center, how she entered into it, the fact that she was renowned within her community, the most famous potter within her community of Kwali, collected by the emir of Abuja at the time, Alhaji Suleiman Barau. And it began to reveal this entanglement between indigenous Nigerian Bari pottery, British studio pottery, and certainly from my perspective, there was an overshadowing of these interactions. And this overshadowing occurred for multiple reasons. It was a project that originated during the colonial period in Nigeria. Kaju had come to Nigeria, employed by the Nigerian colonial government in the 50s to establish a pottery training center to introduce European ceramics techniques thrown on the wheel glazing into a context where it did not exist before. Now, whilst there was a level of respect and appreciation for what had existed for centuries, there was this overshadowing of what already existed there. The fact that it was matrilineal-led, women in this part of Kwali, Bari women have been making coiling, hand building for centuries. Why then does this Western way of making become the dominant narrative? And I really had a problem with that, just putting it plainly. We cannot unseat or overshadow the indigenous for something else or put it at a lesser level. Because I was finding that there was a lot of just taken away of the agency, in my view, for Barry hand building, for Kwali's technique in light of this colonial project by way of the Pottery Training Center. So that was the beginning of my question. How does this become more balanced, and how does this become centered on the truth of what was existing there prior, really? So that was a starting point. And what I would also say as well is that in my time growing up in Nigeria in the 90s and coming to the UK, where I was born as a teenager, even though I'd lived there as a young child, there were just these different histories being presented to me. On the one hand, there were things that I knew very little of, or were just mentioned quite fleetingly. So, for example, Ladi Kwali did come up in my education, but not really engaged in an in-depth way about this history. It was just more for a sort of recognition of her achievements. A woman from Kwali who gained all this international esteem and prestige, and really not dealing with the colonial overshadowing of that legacy. And on the other side, in the UK, she was historicized in a way that was almost, as I've mentioned before, relegating her history to a sort of lesser value than this intervention that came from the West. So that's a bit of a background into these histories and how they're operating across these two geographies in Nigeria, in the UK, and just really trying to clarify and also elevate who she was, where she came from, and this method of barrier hand building that had been passed on from one generation to the next, from mothers to their daughters, in her case, from her aunt to herself.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I love to kind of pull out the thread that you were talking about of reclamation of both your personal heritage, but also, Kwali as a figure, as a historical figure, and the embodied knowledge of making that, not only she had, but has passed down to other people. And really want to talk about language as an important tool of reclamation. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the title of the show. Oftentimes, it comes at the end of a project, although, as a viewer, that's one of the first things that you see and you hear about. I would love to know a little bit more about what you want some of the takeaways of the exhibition to be, and really rooted in those words as an invite or provocation.
Okay. Well, there's I'm trying to unpack. I'll just start with where the title comes from. I probably see it more as an invitation to really, I mean, when we talk about ceramics, pottery, and clay, there are just so many things about it that have to do with the body from its extraction from the earth. There's a labored bodily engagement to get in the clay from the earth. To make work in this hand building coiling method that we're talking about, the body and movement is what enables form to emerge. So there is that in terms of how the body's negotiating and moving in space and with the material to create. And then there is this vessel, this object, this form that has existed as long as humans have existed. It's found in every geographical location. It means so many things. Its use and its function moves between the domestic space into the spiritual, into conceptual. And I don't think you can talk about or think about ceramics and clay without thinking about this form of the vessel, its meaning, its symbolism, and the fact that it continually is redefined and it evolves over time. In relation to this show, and in particular, having this foundation with Kwali, the water pot becomes a vessel that goes through a transformation process. The fact that prior to her joining the pottery training center that Kaju had set up in 54, she was making functional water vessels. These were vessel forms used for collecting and storing water. They weren't glazed like we see in the image on screen. They're porous, so that in the sort of hot Kwali or northern Nigerian context, they keep water cool. And then this experimentation that Kaju introduced turned them into something else, something decorative, something now desirable, firing at high temperature as opposed to open air firing, and glazing them makes the vessel heavier and denser and not fit for purpose, as it were. And then the vessel becomes something else, right? It moves from function into art object. But then I was also interested in this idea of a vessel, like, and really a nod to Christina Sharp's inquiry, what can a vessel be? That a vessel can be multiple things. It can be a stand-in for the body. It can be a holder of a belief. It can be something functional. So this expansiveness of the form and its meaning, as opposed to a literal interpretation of the vessel, all of that coming together in this curatorial inquiry that began with this transition that happened to Kwali, joining the Pottery Training Center, and then we see extending across generations in the show. And also the idea that a method, this coiling hand building method that I keep referencing, originates in a place in northern Nigeria, in Kwali, with Bari women. And that method has been taken up by Black women in the diaspora. A continuity that historically would have gone down familiar lines now moves into the non-familiar, the diasporic, taking up this method as a way to connect to the ancestral, to an indigenous way of making. What does that actual method then, what does that say about vessel making or vessel-like objects, or objects that can be part vessel or sculptural? Really returning to this expansiveness of this form, of its meaning, of its interpretation, of its use. So the show is doing those things, and the title Body Vessel Clay is an invitation to think about this continual shifts and overlapping, that clay itself as a material is always going through a process of transformation in the maker's hand, in the hands of Black women in particular. So yeah, this is really these were just words that kept coming up as I was researching, as I was thinking through a presence and absence of the body, an absence of Kwali's body, and just these connotations, really, an invitation to think about the continual shifts and transformation that clay enables.
For sure. Yeah, that is so rich. I love what you're saying about, the vessel also being a body, also being a process. I think all of that is incredibly rich. And I love how you really started with those words, as you said, as an invitation for the exhibition. I'd love to also go back, thinking about, historically, framing, a real person, a real figure, Kwali, and just even thinking about how she's seen through the lens of Cardew, and maybe my question really is, what parts of her personality did you gather, kind of sorting through the account of Cardew?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the challenges is that I'm kind of like presented with archival material about her written by somebody else. So Michael was incredibly meticulous in terms of documenting his years in Abuja. These papers of Michael Cardew held in archives at the Craft Study Centre and the V&A, now the V&A East in England, where he was journaling essentially diary entries of almost every single day during the decades that he spent in Nigeria. And so on the one hand, they are pretty much the most comprehensive account of her time in Abuja. At the time, that's not her whole life, but in terms of recorded, written down, preserved. And of course, it's his subjective gaze. And also, you have to take into account that he was in a position of power within this project, Pottery Training Center, Abuja, at the time. He was in charge. So there are all those things to think about in terms of perception and how she's depicted through his writing. Some of the accounts are very honest as well about so for example, during these demonstration tours in the US in 72, which lasted about 2.5 months, he writes about Kwali's dissatisfaction, about just how demanding the tours were, going to all these different places. It was her first time in America, going to all these different venues, from museums to historically Black colleges and university, and having to, mostly build these water pots that we see in the image for an audience, and keep that momentum going, whether she was in the mood or not. She asks for more money because she thinks she should be paid more, and she also wanted leisure time as well, which in his account he kind of really didn't understand why she would want to go out and go shopping in the US, because there was this perception that she was a woman who was here to build pots and show to an audience, a sort of very, coordinated audience, these Wari African hand building, and that should be all she should be concerned with. And also the fact that, so that's, sort of one set of archives that I was engaging with. To date, I haven't come across a recorded interview of Kwali, or her voice coming through letting us know about her experiences with cardio and in Abuja. So there are gaps. And then having to engage with Kwali's families in Kwali and Suleja recently, the fact that I'm getting accounts from generations who, it's almost been 40 years since she's passed away. These are inherited narratives as well. And there's a fixation on her achievements, right? There is this, we need to tell you about all what she achieved. We're so proud of her. So there's a bit of a disconnect with actually getting close to what she was really like in terms of her personality beyond the things that she was able to achieve, the opportunities that she created for those around her. And you're trying to, I mean, what I've been very conscious about is that I'm not trying to fill in gaps where there are gaps. It's working with an incomplete historicization, but trying to honor Kwali's agency, her artistry, and also to present in the exhibition for people who have seen it and hopefully people who will see it in New York, is that the images presented of her show a confident, self-assured maker. There's no doubt about that in my eyes and in the eyes of many people that Kwali was confident and self-assured in her making. You see it in the image. And in the forms that emerge, absolutely symmetrical, which she made very quickly and astutely. And I guess positioning the exhibition and this research as letting the objects and letting the image also give a sense of her personality, where there is an absence of her voice, as opposed to speaking over or speaking in place of, in a sense.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. As you were talking, I was just thinking of Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation and how you're really, activating that theory in your practice of, reclaiming all of this information that you're getting through a colonial prism and, putting it into conversation with all of these contemporary makers. I'd love to hear, a little bit more about the embodied knowledge side of not only her practice, but in conversation with the other makers, and maybe how you chose who would be in conversation with her.
Okay. I mean, with the show, it was it was very important to have like an intergenerational dialogue around this idea of embodied knowledge. As I mentioned, the fact that this method of coiling and hand building had, sort of expanded from Kwali globally. Magdalene Odondo being a really important reference point. She went to Nigeria in the 70s, 74. She had met Michael Cardew in England. At the time, he had retired, and he encouraged her to go to the Pottery Training Centre to learn practical skills and also pottery making skills from Barry women and women, the Barry women there, Ladi Kwali included, and other women, Asabi Ido, Kainde, Shafa, Lamitoto. And so she went to Nigeria and learned this coiling hand-built method for making pottery. And in fact, a lot of ceramicists and artists who work with clay that I've met over the years in conversation have come to know Ladi Kwali through engaging with Magdalene Odondo, because Magdalene Odondo cites this time she spent in Abuja as completely transformative and a really sort of lasting impact on the way she makes. She's still coiling and hand building in this Bari tradition, and it also got her looking at global pottery traditions in Kenya, across the continent, and globally as well. And a sort of, okay, so we have this method that is extending, but then how do you make it your own, right? So when Magdalene came back from her time in Nigeria, and there's an early pot in the exhibition where it's looking closer to more traditional Bari water pots. So she's making in this style and, close to what she's learned. But then how do you differentiate yourself from your mentors and the people who taught you? And she comes to making, so this is the pot that I'm speaking about. It's not glazed. It has these geometric inscriptions. There's a blend between terracotta and ash to give it this coloration. And then she moves into this language of a more sort of sculptural form, as we see here, where the surface, it's still hand-built, it's still coiled, but the surface is burnished, polished with different materials like smooth pebbles and the backs of spoons to give it this sheen. Again, it's not glazed. She's using a slip and then burnishing the surface. So there's an evolution from the tradition of Bari hand building into this language of Magdalene's own making, honoring that tradition, but turning it into something where the vessel becomes, or the vessel form becomes, something more akin to a sculptural language. She's described as, capturing some elements of movement, perhaps a ballet dancer mid-pirouette. She's trying to capture that moment of elegance and stillness mid-motion in these vessels. And yes, so there's a direct lineage. We see this moving outside of the familial into Magdalene as somebody who learned and studied Kwali and other Bari women. So it's moving out into the diaspora. And then a generation of artists who have come to these more ancestral ways of making outside of what they've learned in their educational system through looking at Magdalene and others through travel. For example, Bisila Noha, outside of her ceramics education, was very curious about Black women makers who were the grandmothers and mothers of clay in different geographical locations. She had made one of these two-legged forms a couple of years ago, and then she found out that there was a woman maker in Ivory Coast, Maker Kaka, who had made exactly the same form. And she was quite horrified that she'd never heard of Maker Kaka, but she had heard of all the other makers in Western ceramics, British studio pottery history. And how is she making a form so close to one made by an Ivorian woman, but she can't cite her as a reference? And so this opened up a wider research project for Basila, where she went to Ivory Coast to find Kwame Kakaha. She wasn't sure if she was alive or dead at the time. She thought she was no longer alive. And they encountered each other, and she explained to her about the work she was making and how Kakaha had unknown to her at the time had inspired these forms, whereas Basila was responding to being somebody of Equatorial Guinea Spanish heritage, biracial, existing in two cultures, two worlds through this vessel form, She was also interested in combining techniques. What does it mean to throw and then hand build? What does it mean to follow the gestures of the hand and also of the wheel? And how does that come together in a vessel that could be seen as a hybrid of techniques? Also collecting clay from Banat, Equatorial Guinea, where her father's side of the family, that's where the heritage comes from. What does it mean to collect clay from my ancestral land and form that into a contemporary vessel? These kinds of associations and meaning coming through, again, drawing from the past, but making it relevant and making it your own language in the present. We move on to an artist like Phoebe Collins-James, who trained as a potter, traditionally making more, I guess, traditional vessels, and moves into this language of sculpture, ceramics, is working with West African coiling and hand building traditions, but is quite interested in this vessel being something that exists or could come into a meaning that exists between worlds, as it were. Infidels, this outsider figure, the texture and the surfaces inspired by the light of the moon, bringing the mythological as a way for understanding the vessel form. What does it mean for a vessel to be sculptural? What does it mean for something to be vessel-like and sculptural at the same time? All of these different association. And I guess one thing that I keep coming back to is this sense of a hybridity in which these contemporary works operate in, almost in a way connecting to this idea of what if we abandoned categorization when we talk about ceramics and clay and really return to methods of making, the forms that emerge, the image of the maker as well, and the politics of the clay itself, interlapping intersectional meanings, and forms and objects that appear.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that too. As you're talking, I mean, I feel like the exhibition does a really great job of showcasing this, but there's such a kinship in ceramics. But even within that, there's, kinship of Black women working in ceramics. I feel like I have so many adoptive ceramic aunties and stuff, and it's so lovely to be able to see that visually as well. And I would love to hear more about even how the physicality of clay, its weight, its texture, its malleability, and how that may inform your understanding of some of these intangible things that you're talking about of, Black feminism, of ancestral knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's also this universality, and you asked a question about language earlier, which it's kind of coming up as you asked this question, where the clay becomes this connective language across all of the different artists, past and present. It becomes a language of connectivity. It also becomes, it's something that surrounds all of us wherever we are, and it becomes this sort of, I guess, like a material line of connectivity, and allowing for these different exchanges to happen. Across the show, we have artists who are using this coiling method or maybe started there. Simone Lee's a really great example of an artist who was looking at this method, and still carries that method into working on larger sculptural work, into the monumental as well. And the fact that if you think about a method that was really that perhaps began on working with quite intimate functional vessels to be translated into something more. That's this continuity that we're talking about, the fact that there is still a connection to making that way, even as scale experimentation, non-functional, non-literal vessel-like forms emerge. And then we can sort of think about some of the motifs that appear in the exhibition as well. Weaving, braiding, Simone, Anina, other forms of know-how that have existed in Black communities as well. Anina's work, I think, is super interesting in the fact that she's taken this language of weaving baskets that her late grandmother imparted onto her, and making it permanent through a firing process, through clay, a way of sort of holding that embodied matrilineal, familial way of making into something that can last forever. Well, unless it sort of broke, but sort of, a permanence. And I love that honoring of the tradition through clay. We have Adebomi Badibo. I mean, the process goes right through to the site of her enslaved ancestors in the Fort Mott plantations and the Carolinas. She's collecting the soil. She's making her own clay back in Philadelphia to create these vessels to honor and name her enslaved ancestors who were buried on this land. Most of the land is owned by white plantation owners' ancestors. And bringing them a recognition through these vessels, through these celebratory funerary vessels as they were. Scott and Ada in particular has Carolina rice, one of the crops farmed on these plantations, but reclaiming that history of violence and dislocation and displacement into a vessel that names and celebrates and honors them, and also going through this laborious process of reclaiming the land and transforming it into something meaningful as well. I don't know if I quite covered all of the
Yes,
questions. Like
absolutely.
dropped
Yeah,
out.
actually, I was going to go back to the Simone Leigh Village series work to kind of meditate for a moment. Something that I've been thinking about, even with this exhibition and studying it and going back and thinking about it, is that there's a way to do a double take of things that you've, been so used to seeing, and you get something new out of it every time. For me with this work, after spending considerable time, with Simone Leigh's, entire practice and many of her works, from my work at the ICA, now in conversation with Anina Major's work, modeled after Bahamian basket weaving at the market. Now I'm seeing all of these different connections that I never noticed before, like realizing how it takes a village to braid hair. It takes a village for people to learn that process. A lot of people learn it from their mothers or their aunties or different people in their family. And just that idea of transference from, person to person. And I was curious if there are other works where you had a similar epiphany of, sitting with the work so many times and you get something new, or, have a double take.
Yeah, I mean, with every time so this is like the third iteration of the exhibition, and I mean, some of the works have changed, some of them have remained the same. Um, I mean, I guess also when we move away from the sculptures and the objects and we come into these works that speak about performance and clay itself, yeah, I feel like every time I've encountered these videos, they are saying very different things to me. So for example, with Chinasa's piece Row, um, where she had performed, it was a durational performance, part of a performance at a festival in England called Spill. And the piece was really reflecting on a trip Chinasa had made to Nigeria to attend a funeral, and having left Nigeria years prior as a young child, there were certain memories and impression of her hometown that stayed with her. The ochre earth, was really something very prominent, and also through grief and mourning, this idea of the body connecting to land. In that case, the trip, connecting her back to her childhood, but also the weight of a burial within the context. And so she's in this durational performance with a mound of ochre clay, 30 kilograms, and goes through a series of actions, molding, on making, immersing herself in this material, trying to connect to it, be a part of it. And the limitations that she faced with she was faced with through this duration. And then on the other hand, Jade's performance work Clay, where she's reflecting on growing up in North Yorkshire in England, English countryside, as a person of color, and the fact that so much of this land is, well, the owners of the land have benefited from slavery in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And what does it mean to sort of inhabit this land as a Black body? What does it mean that destruction and violence on one part of the world results in wealth, generational wealth on the other part of the world? And how do you resolve that in the body that you're in? And these series of actions that she has this memory of going into the countryside to play and make things out of clay, but then not really having an ownership of this land that was accessible to her. And then the ways that Adebumi is negotiating that with coming to terms with her personal history and her relationship to the land of her enslaved ancestors, and all of these things coming together in an object, in a sculpture, in performance, the sense of becoming and unbecoming through the material itself. And to return us back to the material itself in its raw form, before it's shaped, molded, transformed by all of the different elements that these objects appear from and the alchemical processes that inform them. So it's been a process of re-looking and looking again, quite like what you said, actually. Even things that you're familiar with then begin to speak, and then we see this portals, as it were, open up across geographies, across time, across objects, I'm just even going to come back to the exhibition design where with Antoinette Oni and Nonsi Mutiti, Lisa Mary, the team at Ford Foundation Gallery, when we were sort of thinking about what the exhibition should look and feel like, I mean, I kept saying particularly to Antoinette, oh, I think we should be in the belly of a pot. This just became I mean, maybe it was going to be the title at one point, but it already had a title. But there was this sense of what is inside this vessel that, as I mentioned earlier, in relation to Sharp, this possibilities that might exist inside this container that might be holding a soul, that can be holding water, that can be holding air. What would it feel like to sort of try to think about that as an exhibition space where this history isn't linear? Of course, there are timelines as to when people were making work and existed, but the fact that this question of clay and this question of Black women transforming clay is something that is cyclical. So how then can this exhibition embody that? If there was an imagining of something existing within the inside. And so we looked at many water pots by Ladi Kwali, and this wall color is actually drawn from one of the water pots at the front of the show, because we're trying to imagine what the inside of a water vessel, what it would feel like to inhabit that. And then at the entrance of the show, I mean, it was Antoinette and Nancy were exceptional in the fact that we all came together to work together on this project. Antoinette had seen the show in London. Nancy hadn't. Antoinette and I have worked together on exhibition design, but they were very much looking at what Ladi Kwali made, even patterns on her clothes, looking at roulettes from some documentation that I had from Suleja, these imprints on wooden roulettes to make geometric bands on the vessels. This is the identity that you see at the start of the exhibition. On the side of the wall with the yellow, it's all of the roulettes that Nancy picked out, because also wanting to talk about this line of continuity through the coiling, through this pattern that begins with Kwali and doesn't really end with the artist in this show, right? It's something that extends beyond to anybody who takes up this method and this way of working, this infinite line of meaning across the show, across objects, through the exhibition, back into this performances of making and unmaking, continuity.
Yes, thank you for that. A lot of that felt like even new information for me. I love, hearing more about the exhibition design. Of course, I nerd out about those types of things, so that's lovely to hear. And even thinking about the wall as like an inside of a vessel, I think is just beautiful and very poetic. I kind of want to pose this question as the last question to you, and then we can, open it up for Q&A here soon. But is there something that you would like to share that you haven't really gotten to with my questions that you would like to leave our viewers with today?
I guess, I mean, one of the things that this exhibition project has really gifted me is, a real sort of appreciation and understanding and a sort of, critical need to really step back into things as they were before this colonial intervention defined a lot of who we are as Black people, as people in the diaspora, that it's important to really sort of engage as much as we can with the before. And I'm talking about a before that can come from oral traditions, even this fragmented narratives of what people know. They're still valuable. It's still valuable to know about the things that haven't been written down, the things that haven't been put into books. And I mean, I'm from a different part of Nigeria, so it's also a project that has really opened my understanding to even what this whole idea of, we call ourselves Nigerians, but we had so many different names and, so many different things pre all of that. And it's really important to attend to that, really. And as much as there might be a fragmented, disrupted, interruptive history, there is still value in celebrating, holding, coming to terms with these ancestral knowledges, a lot of which are disappearing, by the way. And then that can't be allowed to happen, really.
Thank you so much for all of your amazing answers. It was a pleasure to be in conversation with you as always. I would love to turn it back to Chloe for our next steps.
Wow, thank you so much, Chenoa and Jareh, for that conversation, which was such a pleasure to listen to. I encourage those of you in the audience who have a question to please post it at the link in the chat, and I will turn to you next. We have one question so far, and it's from Chidima. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for working to bring this exhibition together and hosting this talk. As a Nigerian American ceramicist and a third generation apprentice to Ladi Kwali's knowledge, it's so important. My question, how do you think we can maintain the integrity and sacrality of these indigenous techniques while continuing to share the knowledge across the diaspora, where it certainly intersects with Western and colonial institutions? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we need to keep talking about it. It took a lot to bring this show to New York. Lisa, Ford Foundation, Gallery, we had conversations for many years. But 3 years after the original exhibition in the UK, I think that also a lot of ceramics and indigenous ceramics also exists in museum collections through that lens as well to kind of bring this into, I guess, less of a specialist collection space. Comes with its challenges, but it's something that yeah, it just needs more sort of passion and drive and exchanges outside of the exhibitions as well, writing, scholarship, driving that too. I mean, as I was carrying out this research, it also became apparent to me that this cannot just exist in the context of Western audiences, but what does it mean when you can't take museum loans to the continent? I've turned to filmmaking. I made a documentary in 2023 about Ladi Kwali's legacy, which this year has been shown in Dakar, in Kwali Town, in Abuja. What are different ways of disseminating research that are less institutional, academic, a combination of these things really is always at the forefront, certainly in this project in particular, and just other ways of really driving how research moves and travels and lives on really and is accessible as well.
Thank you so much for that question and for that answer, Jareh. Um, I'll ask a question. I feel like you've talked a lot in this conversation today about the importance of gaps and this expansive possibility that exists within the gaps. But then I was also really struck by what you said about how we have no voice or no vocal recording of Ladi Kwali and how there's this sort of lack of voice and personality that exists in the archives. And I wonder how you think about those things in your own research and as you developed this project, how you think about archiving work and how that process has developed for you as a researcher through this work and through other work that you do.
Thank you, Chloe, for that question. Yeah, I think when Chenoa and I were exchanging, it didn't come up, but there was a question about um, maybe what one could deem as a failure in work or how things land, this kind of thing. I don't know if I got that question entirely correct. But you know, the elephant in the room for me really was I'm doing this work on Ladi Kwali, honoring her legacy, but I don't have a direct reference to how she really felt about all of this, right? And it is challenging. It's challenging to have accounts that talk about her being interviewed, but having no record of it, or record that has come my way. I certainly haven't come across it in all the archives that I visited. Interview or transcript of her words, particularly of the way that this Pottery Training Center project took her out into this internationalism that we have come to know her from. But and also going to Kwali to make this documentary was a response to that, right? If the archive can only provide me with this much and this history and this way, there needs to be another way to engage with this history. Going to Kwali and Suleja to meet her family members, as I mentioned, for this documentary, The Enduring legacy of Ladi Kwali was a way to sort of counteract that. So what are the people who have inherited her legacy? I met one or two people who knew her, and I interviewed them. Two have sadly passed away in the space of 2 years. And so for me, this felt like something closer to addressing those gaps, because this was returning back that agency and the account to the context of where she's from, even though it's generations after, as a way to sort of come closer to her voice, as it were.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I can't thank you both enough again for this conversation today, which has been just such a pleasure to get to listen to. Jareh, I know you're going to close us out with a reading. So with that, I'm going to pass you the microphone for your reading, and I'll pull up the last slide.
Okay, thank you. Okay. The ancestral African tradition to which I belong tells me that clay is a portal. It is not inert. It breathes and it remembers. Across many West African cultures, clay is associated with femininity, fertility, healing, and spiritual power. It is used to mark rites of passage, to build shrines, and to connect the living with the dead. In my Nigerian indigenous group, Uye, the clay pot is part of the symbol or crest of our Uye General Improvement Union, UGIU, composed of 3 elements: a lion, a hand, and an earthen pot. The hand-built pot here represents collective memory and cultural integrity. The lion symbolizes protection, ensuring that nothing harmful befalls the Uwe people in their affairs and struggles through time. Clay in this sense is more than material. It is a vessel of knowledge, a guardian of secrets, a keeper of ancestral continuity. In Yoruba cosmology, on the other hand, clay is central to the creation myth where Orisha or Batala molds human bodies from clay before Olodumare breathes life into them. In other regions, such as among the Wari or Nupe, women potters do not simply make vessels. They channel ancestral techniques, speak to spirits through their hands, and ground communal knowledge in their work. Clay is living. It carries cosmologies, land, memory, the touch of grandmothers. Ceramicists have told me that you must listen to clay or it will deal with you. It teaches you a lesson in the kiln, a rebellion when it explodes, when it cracks, when it resists, because it was intended to, or it wasn't respected. In the context of body vessel clay, Black women, ceramics, and contemporary arts, Ladi Kwali is foundational. In this centennial year of her birth, she poignantly stands as a point of departure for the exhibition, not only for considering clay as material and a matrilineal legacy, but also for acknowledging that her emergence as the star of Kadiu's Abuja project led to a quiet rebellion against cultural and societal odds. Not formally educated, childless, and working within a colonial framework designed to contain her, Kwali nonetheless resisted the limitations imposed upon her. She defied the gaze that has since shaped her historicization. We see this resistance in the visual record. Her assured posture and confident presence are captured in the surviving photographs and few film clips of her most widely available on the internet, in which she is silent, building a pot. We glimpse it too in the diary entries of Michael Cardew, which, despite their colonial lens, have become a partial window through which we encounter her presence. In the absence of direct interviews or personal accounts, these records provide a fragmented insight into her experience at the Pottery Training Center, since renamed the Ladi Kwali Pottery Training Center in Abuja, now called Suleja, and the role it played in shaping her legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for closing us out with that reading, Jareh. That was beautiful. And thank you so much to you and Chenoa again for this really beautiful conversation today. And congratulations on the exhibition. If you are in New York, please go to Ford Foundation Gallery to go see this show. Run there right after this. It will be on until December 6th. And I encourage you to please spend time with the show. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to the Terra Foundation for American Art and Tiger Foundation, who sponsor this program, The New Social Environment, and make conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, where you'll be able to watch this again shortly. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports us, our writers, our staff, and our operations. You can support our work at the link in the chat. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Charisse Perlina Weston and Lumi Tan on the occasion of Miss May Squeeze at Jack Shaman Gallery. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today. And please join me in thanking Jareh and Chenoa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Take care, Jareh and Chenoa. Have a great weekend.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. You too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Oh, thank you.